Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience with us this afternoon or morning. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the National Science Foundation's newest directorate, the Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP, as we call it. My name is Kelly Monteroso, and I am the TIP Communications Specialist. I will be moderating the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. We also have two colleagues answering written questions, Peter Atherton, a Program Director for our SBIR STTR program, and Daniel Getzel, Entrepreneurial Lead for our Regional Innovation Engines program. A few notes about logistics. We'll have a presentation for about 45 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions. And this session will be recorded. The recording link will be sent to all registrants. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Irwin Gyanchandani, Assistant Director of Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, leading the new TIP Directorate at the National Science Foundation. Irwin has spent the last 10 years in leadership roles at NSF, mostly in the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate, or SCIES, where he helped develop and launch several new NSF initiatives, including the Smart and Connected Communities Program, Civic Innovation Challenge, Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research, and the National Artificial Intelligence Research Institutes. Irwin has an interdisciplinary background spanning computer science and biomedical engineering, and he has a passion for developing public-private partnerships and a vision for TIP. With that, Irwin, please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Kelly, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with all of you today. Really appreciate you all taking the time from your busy schedules to tune into this webinar and to spend some time with us today to hear about the new Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate at the National Science Foundation. What I thought I would do this afternoon is start by spending a little bit of time providing some context, a little bit of the inspiration and motivation for why a new directorate and why now at the National Science Foundation as well. I will then talk a little bit about some of the key functions that derive from the mission for this new directorate and how that mission aligns with the mission of NSF as a whole, as well as some of the programmatics that then align with those functions. And then I'll provide a little bit of closing with a bit of status of where we are as a directorate today and what we're looking to do as we head into the fall and into the months ahead as well. So let me first start with a little bit of that inspiration or motivation for a new directorate, and I hope you'll indulge me with a little bit of a history lesson to start here as well. So some of you may know that 75 years ago, an individual named Vannevar Bush published a manuscript called Science, the Endless Frontier, and wrote that really in response to a request for the president. It was a report to the president at the time, really outlining the value proposition for federal investment in basic research. And Vannevar Bush's work came on the heels of World War II, and it came on the heels of the Manhattan Project as well, and really was an ode to making the case for why federal investment in basic research is so critical to being able to power the frontiers of science and engineering, and in turn to power the frontiers of society and economy as well. And as a matter of fact, if you look forward over the next 7 decades plus to where we are today, I would argue that in many ways, Bush's vision of this endless frontier powered by science and basic discovery is one that has indeed paid dividends and borne fruit in the form of new societal and economic growth all across this country and all around the world for that matter as well. If we fast forward to where we are today as a society, 2022, one would argue that we are facing a similar sort of defining moment as the U.S. faced on the heels of World War II. It's just that the characteristics of that moment are different. We are facing intense global competition from countries all around the world in a number of key technology areas, whether it be advanced manufacturing or advanced wireless or artificial intelligence or biotechnology powering the next generation bioeconomy and so on. Across this entire spectrum of technology areas, it is absolutely the case that countries are investing and investing heavily to ensure leadership and to ensure progress that can ultimately contribute to societal and economic growth. At the same time, I think we would argue, and indeed the National Science Board has spoken to each of these dimensions, but particularly to this dimension in its Vision 2030 report that it published a few years back, the National Science Board being a governing body for NSF, really spoken to the fact that a lot of federal investment continues to be concentrated on the coasts and big cities, in certain universities. And there's an opportunity for us to really harness the diversity of talent that exists across the country. In fact, one could argue that it's the diversity that makes up the U.S. that in many ways offers us a competitive advantage in and of itself. But there's an opportunity for us to do a much better job of being able to engage individuals and organizations and regions that maybe haven't been as engaged in the conduct of research, but yet still have significant perspectives and backgrounds and experiences to be able to bring to bear. And then finally, a third reason for this being a defining moment are the socioeconomic challenges that we face today. Whether it be climate change, whether it be inequities in terms of access to education or access to healthcare or access to broadband connectivity, a means that affords access to information and the basic currency of information that really drives a lot of what we do today. Those inequities are bearing out in a number of different ways. And then finally, critical and resilient infrastructure as well. We've seen, for example, how the stresses of climate change have had impacts on our critical infrastructure in the form of power outages in the state of Texas after a winter storm a year and a half ago, or in the form of the stressors on our electric grid as a result of the intense heat waves that we've seen. And we see what's bearing down on Florida even as we speak today, unfortunately. And so in many respects, as we think about the socioeconomic challenges, and there are just 3 examples on this slide, you could conceivably consider other examples as well of how we face many of these today all across the spectrum. And so in many ways, this defining moment is about those technology areas that I described a few slides ago, advanced manufacturing, advanced wireless, AI, and so forth, really intersecting with some of these societal and economic challenges as well, climate, equity, critical infrastructure. As we think about the climate challenge, for instance, it inspires new research in wireless and sensing capabilities and AI-based innovations. And as we have innovations in each of those areas, that also gives us new lenses into the climate challenge or the equity challenge or the critical infrastructure challenge and so on. And so there are real opportunities for us to be able to stitch these together and think about this intersectionality as part of this defining moment that we face today. Global competition, the missing millions, and how we can do a better job of engaging the missing millions, and the socioeconomic challenges, just a few examples of which I illustrated a few slides ago. And so as I think about this defining moment, it's also paired by an evolving research and innovation ecosystem. Regardless of the field that you may be in, regardless of the work that you may be doing, I would argue that the pace of discovery in every aspect of science and engineering and in many sectors of our society and economy has been dramatically accelerated as a result of access to unprecedented amounts of data, as well as emerging technologies, be it machine learning or other types of capabilities that allow us to be able to harness those data and really extract out meaningful insights that can inform new discoveries and new innovations as well. When we think about today's researchers, particularly early career researchers, many of them will say that they went into science and technology and engineering and mathematics specifically because they are deeply interested in trying to be able to bring their research backgrounds and perspectives, their innovations to bear in a positive way on society. And so thinking through that is another element. That demand for societal impact is another element of our evolving research and innovation ecosystem. And then finally, when we think about where talent is today, in many ways, talent is highly distributed across different sectors, no longer concentrated strictly in academia or strictly in industry for that matter, but really in civil society broadly, in nonprofits and foundations, in communities of practice. And so we have an opportunity to be able to stitch together that talent to create the blended teams through partnerships that allow us to be able to advance the discoveries and innovations that will pave the way into the future. So when I think about everything that I've described up until this point, the defining moment that we face today, when I think about some of the key challenges that we face in that regard, but at the same time, the evolution of the research and innovation ecosystem as well. This is really about catalyzing a paradigm shift to a certain degree. A lot of what the National Science Foundation has done over the course of the last 7 decades plus has been to support largely investigator-driven science, and primarily that means academic research teams, so faculty and students in academia, and it has resulted in a steady stream of discoveries that have improved our prosperity, improved our overall quality of life. And we want to do more of that. By no means are we moving away from that focus. But at the same time, I think increasingly it's also important for us to think about the users, the beneficiaries, the consumers of the research that we're trying to support, and have them engage with researchers and students from the start in shaping and conducting the research and piloting solutions that emerge from the research in the very same context where some of those challenge problems first motivate and first surface. And so this is really about multi-sector teams that put an emphasis on the important societal or economic or technological problems that are driving the research pursuits as we go forward. So in many ways, this is a little bit of an expansion from a strict focus on great ideas, great faculty, great students, great individuals who lead to new technological discoveries and innovations that we then push to the market, to bringing the market to the table from the start, if you will. And by market, it's more than just industry. It's all these different sectors that you see on this slide, really bringing society to the table to help inspire the research directions and be then motivated to pull the innovations out into society more generally as well. So going from sort of technology push to an expansion to also sort of a market or societal demand or pull as well. And so in many ways, I started this talk by referring to Vannevar Bush and the Science, the Endless Frontier manuscript that he published many, many decades ago. And I'm going to end this segment with Jumpstarting America. This is a book that's been published much more recently, just in the last few years. And this book really speaks to the opportunity that exists in all corners of our country. The fact that there are challenges, but there are also diverse talents all across this country. And we have that opportunity to be able to harness that as we think about the research directions and the innovation potential into the future as well. And in many ways, that vision is what is, in our view, espoused by and motivates the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 that Congress passed and the President signed into law earlier this summer. And while this act appropriates $54 billion for semiconductor incentives and R&D and workforce development, and that's the CHIPS part of the bill, if you will, that's got a lot of attention by the mainstream media, it also authorizes the National Science Foundation and other science agencies. And in the case of NSF, it authorizes $81 billion over the next 5 years, including a significant plus up for the agency and funding for a new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or a TIP Directorate here at the Foundation. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what the inspiration is. Where does this all come from? It's not every day that we stand up a new directorate. As a matter of fact, it's been 32 years since NSF last stood up a new directorate. And so what's really motivating us to move along this trajectory as we think about this new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships? So I'm going to transition now to talking a little bit about the mission space specific for TIP and how that fits in within the broader NSF mission. Some of you who are joining may know this slide really well. Some of you, this may be the first time that you're really interfacing with NSF in our mission space. But since the establishment of the foundation in 1950, we have sought to promote the progress of science, to advance the nation's health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense as well. That's been a part of our mission, and I'd ask that you keep that in mind as I progress and talk about the role of TIP in the context of that mission, because we're not trying to change the mission of the agency. We're rather trying to, in some sense, bootstrap a portion of that mission as we look to the future. So if you think about the different areas of research that we support, we, the federal government or industry or others support, they're largely rendered on this particular slide. The top half of this slide speaks, some of you may be familiar with this slide, by the way, as Pasteur's quadrant. We filled in some of the other quadrants as well. The top half of this slide really speaks to the NSF mission space around basic research. We support the full spectrum from pure basic research to much more use-inspired basic research. So as an example, a few months ago, NSF, together with an international team of scientists and funding agencies, announced the discovery of the black hole in the Milky Way galaxy. And that was the result of decades of curiosity-driven, discovery-based exploration that lended itself to ultimately finding this black hole. There was a lot of technology that was that was necessary to make that happen. There's a lot of use-inspired innovation along the way, but at its heart, the discovery of the black hole was curiosity-driven exploratory science. On the other end of the spectrum was our response to COVID-19, the pandemic just a few years ago. Shortly after the SARS-CoV-2 virus was declared a pandemic, NSF went to work funding hundreds of millions of dollars of researchers all across the country to be able to address the use-inspired, the critical need that we had in the moment, solution-focused innovations that helped us find our way to some extent to where we are today, trying to move out of the pandemic context. For example, it was NSF-funded work on an NSF-funded supercomputer that helped lead to the discovery of the molecular structure of the spike protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which was then the basis for subsequent work by other agencies and others leading to the vaccines that many of us have now come to rely upon. And so really, in many ways, we span that top half of this chart from pure basic research to much more use-inspired basic research. We also have a role in the bottom left-hand corner around translation and innovation. NSF was the first agency to launch the SBIR Small Business Innovation Research Program with a pilot effort back in the 1970s and then formalizing that into a program in the 1980s that other agencies have adopted. And there are other examples of investments that we have made. For example, the I-Corps program, where NSF launched in circa 2010, the NSF Innovation Corps to provide entrepreneurial education to faculty and students to help get research ideas from lab and into the marketplace. And so that's really sort of a third axis, if you will, that emanates from pure basic research, use-inspired basic research, pure applied research, but that's also in the purview of NSF. What we don't do is the bottom right, pure applied research, which does tend to be the purview of other mission agencies like the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy and so forth, and also part of the purview of industry as well. So when I think about that defining moment, when I think about the evolving research and innovation enterprise in this country, where we see an opportunity to put a spotlight as we move forward, and again, not at the expense of pure basic research, but just to sort of amplify another part of our efforts, is around use-inspired basic research, as well as translation and innovation too. And so if you think about NSF's existing directorates today, from the biological sciences to engineering to math and physical sciences and so forth, we think of TIP as a crosscut, as a horizontal that's going to work very, very closely with bio, with engineering, with MPS, with computing and so forth, with the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, to really enhance, to strengthen and scale the investments that are being made by each of those directorates in use-inspired and translational research, but to really elevate them across the board, across our investments in our mission space for the next generation of innovations that can be brought to the market and that can be brought to society as well. So with that as sort of the basis set for the mission space for TIP and how we look to work together with other directorates, let me take just a few moments to describe for you the different functional elements of the TIP directorate. What are our key functions tied to those to that mission space? And sort of a building block. You see at the bottom here all of our existing directorates and offices, and you'll see on the next few slides sort of an overlay that's intentionally horizontal and cross-cutting because that's how we see and how we think about TIP. So as a baseline for us is partnerships, accelerating partnerships among the directorates, but especially so with other sectors and with other communities to be able to bring in that expertise, to be able to bring in shared resources, data sets, test beds and toolkits and so forth, other kinds of resources as well, to be able to help advance the frontiers of discovery and innovation. To some extent, NSF's investments today catalyze partnerships. We fund researchers primarily in academia who can then partner with industry based off of those investments and can really help to expand the footprint of what they're able to achieve. But NSF can also directly partner with industry as well. And so a good example of that is a partnership that we announced back in January with Intel. Intel at the time was announcing an investment to the tune of $20 billion in a couple of new chip-making factories in the state of Ohio. And just a few weeks ago, they did a groundbreaking for that effort also in Ohio, just outside of Columbus. As part of that $20 billion announcement, Intel and NSF came together to announce a $100 million collaboration over the next several years that will specifically support education activities, new curricular materials, new instructional materials, new experiential opportunities for students, but essentially new education activities at all levels, as well as new research activities too, that would enable the next generation of semiconductor design and manufacturing. An important element here is that this is about trying to support colleges and universities all across the country, but with a particular emphasis on community colleges, on minority serving institutions, and on other emerging research institutions as well. But this illustrates how we look to work with other stakeholders in other sectors, in this case partnering with Intel. And just a few weeks ago, we specifically announced the first sort of instantiation of that collaboration, a partnership to fund the development of the high quality manufacturing workforce that we so need. This is a $10 million investment between the TIP Directorate and our colleagues in the Education and Human Resources Directorate here at NSF to specifically advance education and training and improve equitable STEM education at two-year colleges as well as four-year universities. Building on top of that, one layer on top of the partnerships piece for us is thinking about innovation and technology ecosystems. So how do we bring these partners together? How do we bring these partnerships together to really give rise to the ecosystems that will fuel the next generation of innovations and technologies? And here, there are some existing programs that existed at the foundation prior to the establishment of the TIP Directorate that are being repositioned into TIP. And there are also some new investments. You can see the slightly different color scheme here, some new investments that will help us advance key technology areas, advance societal impact areas, also advance innovation as well as learning opportunities for students too. So for example, an existing program that's moving into TIP is the NSF Convergence Accelerator, which we're so excited about. The Convergence Accelerator was established in 2019, and over the course of just 3 years has run essentially close to a dozen tracks now, each one of these tracks focusing in on a different area of technology or a different societal use case, from open knowledge networks that can fuel the next generation of AI systems, to new quantum technologies and platforms, to thinking about the blue economy and what's the ocean sensing potential that can allow us to be able to harness our waterways and clean up our waterways as well, to thinking about persons with disabilities and new opportunities to provide technologies in ways that allow for the equitable participation of persons with disabilities in society. Each one of these tracks funds a set of projects to the tune of $750K or so over the course of a couple of years. And then ultimately we do a down select and fund an effort to really try to prototype and pilot some of those initial research results from phase 1 to phase 2 of a Convergence Accelerator track. Example of this, just a couple of weeks ago, we announced a new investment through the Convergence Accelerator, this one in partnership with the Department of Defense. So another example of NSF directly partnering with other constituents. In this case, this investment is going to support 16 multidisciplinary teams that are looking at how we can enhance our 5G infrastructure, particularly with a focus on security and resilience of that infrastructure going forward. So that's one end of the innovation and technology ecosystem space in terms of existing programs that are moving into the TIP Directorate. On the other end are new programs, and here a flagship one for the TIP Directorate is a program called the NSF Regional Innovation Engines, or NSF Engines program. And so some of you are probably pretty familiar with the fact that we put out a call for proposals for this program back at the beginning of May. This is really a transformative effort for NSF and for the nation if done well at the end of the day. Our goal here is to be able to essentially bring together coalitions of regional partners who are working together from within that region and even beyond that region for that matter, but working together on a particular topic area of relevance to that region and a broader relevance to the nation and to society writ large. And so those partners essentially form this nucleus. And over time, with NSF investment and with a framework that we are developing for the NSF Engines program, we want that nucleus to essentially grow into an innovation ecosystem that pulls in industry and institutions of higher education and government and nonprofits and community organizations, and ultimately grows into a vibrant innovation ecosystem that can be self-sustaining beyond the duration of NSF's investment. So when I think about what makes the NSF Engines program, it's intentionally different to a certain degree from what we do in other investments and other programs across the foundation. It's different in terms of the scale that we're talking about. It's different in terms of, when we talk about scale up to $160 million over a 10-year horizon. It's different in terms of the specific emphasis on co-design and co-creation, bringing together a set of stakeholders who are really going to help to shape the research directions and then be the beneficiaries of the research outputs as well. You could imagine multiple engines that focus in on shared topic spaces. So collectively, they form a cohort that leverage the geographic diversity of the country. The climate problem, for instance, manifests in different ways in different parts of the country. And so how do we have different engines taking different cuts at that problem and then stitching together their outputs so that the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts? We will have milestones for these engines to ensure that they're making progress and to decide upon continued funding. And then success here really looks a little bit different than a traditional NSF research project. This is not about us specifically focusing on research publications and conference proceedings, though we do expect to see that as well. But it's about what are the technology outputs that are going to be emerging from these engines? What are the workforce capabilities that are going to be emerging from these engines? And in particular, as we think about that, how are we going to be growing a next generation of talent at all levels, from the community college degree, associate's degree level, to the four-year institution level, bachelor's degree, to a master's degree, to a graduate degree, and beyond, so that we can have practitioners and entrepreneurs and technicians and researchers working together around a shared problem space. And finally, I'll note that we are also deeply interested in thinking about this as an experiment on its own accord. How do we evaluate the overall approach with regard to the engines in a way that allows us to be able to determine whether we're heading in the right direction or whether we need to implement course corrections as well, and whether this can be a model for success well into the future, even beyond the duration of the engines program itself. So ultimately, our goal with the Engines program is really to be able to try to expand innovation, to harness the geography of innovation that surely exists across the country, but to be able to expand that in a way such that we can go to parts of the country that frankly haven't benefited as much by the technology or innovation booms over the course of the last several decades that we have witnessed. So we were delighted in that regard to be able to see the response from the community, from you all who responded to the Engines program and our initial deadline. It was for concept outlines at the end of June. We've since published the concept outlines that are advancing to a full proposal stage, close to 700 concept outlines, including at least a couple from every state, at least one from many of our territories as well. Really, this map, I think, illustrates how we are seeking to expand that geography of innovation. And similarly, to be able to do so in a whole range of topic spaces, from agriculture to advanced manufacturing, to energy, to climate change, to AI and the bioeconomy, and so forth. And so when we think about these engines, we have currently two proposal types that we are moving forward on. One is really around planning and development work that can lead to a future engine, so an investment on the order of $1 million for a couple of years. And another is about a 10-year trajectory across different phases that we will work closely with each engine that we funded on to be able to see about $160 million investment and ultimately grow to a point where an engine can achieve sort of that self-sustaining maturation point, if you will, to be able to go beyond the lifetime of NSF investment. And so when we think about the engines program and where we are in its implementation, we announced the funding opportunity back at the beginning of May. We did a series of very intense and intentional regional roadshows to try to engage with different parts of the country and really hope to spur participation in the effort. I mentioned that concept outlines were due at the end of June. We held a proposers day and published all of the concept outlines that you saw on those maps at the beginning of August. We've received letters of intent for type 1s, but we are here where the star is right now in terms of having a deadline just later this week for full proposals for the type 1s, and then a deadline for the type 2s later on this fall, this winter, as we look to move forward with making the type 1 awards concurrently as well. I think an important point that I'll illustrate, some of you may be quite familiar with the CHIPS and Science Act language and the Economic Development Administration within the Department of Commerce and how we both have equities in this space. In fact, EDA is called out in the CHIPS and Science Act for standing up a set of regional technology hubs. They also have authorization, but not yet appropriations. So there's a fundamental difference there. They're not yet ready to move forward. And similarly, NSF is called out for the Regional Innovation Engines program. I think of NSF and EDA as operating on a spectrum, and we start from a place of fundamental research, albeit use-inspired in the context of the Regional Innovation Engines. And EDA starts from a place of economic growth. And we see some intentional overlap, which I think is healthy in this particular case because it allows us to be able to see the work of the engines really feeding into the work of the technology hubs when they come online as well. And so another way of thinking about this is a little bit of a Venn diagram. NSF has announced the Regional Innovation Engines call. It really starts from a fundamental research and R&D layer, trying to think about research and translation as the basis, trying to think about how we broaden participation by including folks from populations that have typically been underserved or underrepresented, and ultimately an 8 to 10-year effort per engine. The regional tech hubs, on the other hand, really focusing on the region's now and future economic drivers. So the future part especially derived from some of the outputs of the engines as they come online. This is about scaling up capacity to deploy breakthrough technologies, creating the physical and human and systems infrastructure that you need. And in the middle, there's a lot of shared commonality between these efforts in terms of the focus on place-based innovation, the focus on long-term investments, the focus on economic growth and technology development, and the public and private partnerships that really serve as the connective tissue for building out an innovation ecosystem. So hopefully that gives you a sense of another aspect of the innovation and technology ecosystems, horizontal, that functional layer, if you will, as we seek to really grow out the ecosystems that will have significant impact into the future. And then I'll move forward to the next tranche, if you will, which is around technology translation. So you have partnerships as a foundation that feed into innovation and technology ecosystems, and those ecosystems giving rise to new technologies that we now want to start to translate into the market and into society more generally as well. And here also, there are some existing programs like I-Corps and Partnerships for Innovation and SBIR, which I'll talk about in a second. And there are also opportunities for new and innovative pathways for us to consider as well. And so I think a really important point here is I like to think about this, again, starting from a place of what are the impacts? What are the societal benefits that we want to achieve at the end of the day when we think about the research that we're trying to support, particularly within the TIP Directorate, but I think this is true for some of the other activities all across the foundation as well. And so in that context, you can think about research that gives rise to educational adaptations, that gives rise to impacting government missions. For example, research in the wireless space and spectrum space that can inform spectrum policymaking. There's, of course, lab to market, new startups, new products on the market, and so forth. There's open source ecosystems as well. In some contexts, in some settings, open source offers a competitive advantage relative to some of the more closed box approaches that may be taken instead. And so if you think about the research projects that we support out of the foundation today, there comes a point where we start to think about transitioning those research projects to any one of these potential outcomes. And in fact, some of our programs today have this TTP option where you can get a supplement to be able to start to think about that initial path from research output to hardening that output and progressing toward societal benefit or societal impact. But we also have, beyond that TTP option, the ability to think about specific pathways that we're building out to lead down a particular track. So for instance, lab to market. NSF has pioneered the lab to market platform. We have a program, Partnerships for Innovation, PFI, that allows for partnering with industry on initial licensing of new technologies. I-Core, that provides that experiential entrepreneurial education so that folks can start to think about the market fitness for a particular innovation. What is the market that's out there? And SBIR, STTR, that allows us to be able to do that initial feasibility of a deep tech venture and hopefully put it on a path so that it can lead to a larger venture or ultimately be acquired. So that's one pathway that we have funded and we hope to grow and scale out of the translational aspect of the TIP Directorate. But another is open source ecosystems. And just earlier this year, we launched a program, Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or POES, that allows us to be able to resource faculty and students as their research innovations are coming to the fore on what's the training that's necessary, what's the funding that's necessary to be put onto a path so that you can start to think about an ecosystem that comes together, an ecosystem of innovators who can further that particular research output and potentially give rise to new innovations that could go down the lab to market trajectory or any of these other trajectories as well. And I like to think of this as really bidirectional. So we have the societal benefits, the societal impacts that help inform and shape the research directions. We have new research innovations that we then take down any one of these pathways. And we learn those lessons along the way in a very symbiotic fashion. And so part of our goal with the TIP Directorate in that tranche, that last functional tranche, is to really build out these pathways as we've started to do with lab to market and now open source ecosystems as well. And as a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we were delighted to announce a new investment that we're making in one of those pathways, lab to market, specifically in the I-Core program, bringing I-Core to additional parts of the country by funding 5 new I-Core hubs that will work collaboratively to build and sustain a diverse and inclusive innovation ecosystem, each hub to receive $3 million per year over a 5-year period. And now altogether, we will have 10 regional I-Core hubs, and you can see not quite covering the full geography of the country, but we're getting there, and we look to build that out in the years ahead as well. So hopefully this gives you a sense for how we think about the TIP Directorate and starting from a place of partnerships as a foundational building block, leading into innovation and technology ecosystems, which then in turn inspire new technologies that can drive, that we can then drive forward along a translational pathway to have impact on society and have impact on the economy more generally as well. I think a really important point for us along every step of the way for the TIP Directorate has been thinking about diversity and equity and inclusivity and accessibility as well. For us to achieve success at the end of the day, we have to think about this as an effort, as an initiative that will expand the geography of innovation and the demography of innovation that exists all across the U.S. And so even before we launched the Regional Innovation Engines program, one of the first things that we did was a set of focus groups or listening sessions where we tried to engage diverse institution types, HBCUs, HSIs, TCUs, two-year colleges as well, to really bring together folks from diverse backgrounds and experiences to help us understand what are some of the challenges with engaging with NSF? What are some of the challenges with submitting a proposal for a fairly large investment, for example, from the foundation and so forth? And we've tried to take away some of what we heard from those conversations and use that to inform the design and the evolution of our programmatics as well. So for instance, understanding from those conversations the challenges to building strong partnerships, particularly when you're an institution that's in a remote location, relatively speaking. The need for capacity building. It's not just about supporting research or education. It's about everything that you need around that research apparatus for that to be successful. Policy issues. For example, freeing up time for faculty who have a lot of teaching responsibilities and commitments, freeing up their time by virtue of the way in which we structure the investments and so forth. And so thinking through these dimensions is something that we've strived to do as we've designed our programs. It's one of the reasons, for example, why the Engines program has published all of the concept outlines to engender partnering and teaming and to try to put folks from diverse institutions on a more level playing field as well. And we will continue to do this. That's our commitment. That's our obligation, frankly, as we look to the future as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up with just a few slides that sort of get at the status of where we are with respect to the TIP Directorate. So I'm really proud of the team that's in the TIP Directorate today, a number of program officers and others, administrative team members and so forth, who have come together as part of this directorate from other parts of the foundation as programs were repositioned, but who have also joined the TIP Directorate over the course of the last several months as well. This slide really reflects their hard work and their persistence in ramping up TIP and in realizing the vision for TIP as well. And so starting with even before TIP was established back in January, partnership with Intel that we announced that I talked about earlier, new programs that we've launched, Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, the Engines program, formally launching the Directorate in mid-March. And then more recently, some of the announcements that we have around the DoD collaboration, the I-Core hubs, as well as entrepreneurial fellowships. We just announced funding of Activate to support a new cohort of entrepreneurial fellows who will have the resourcing to be able to think about the lab to market progression as well. So this is a starting point. We're ramping up slowly but surely the TIP Directorate. But at the end of the day, this vision, everything that I've described, it's contingent upon funding, as we all know. And so the President's FY 2023 budget request specifically calls for increasing the budget for the National Science Foundation to close to $10.5 billion. It's about a 20% increase over where we are in the current fiscal year 22, which ends this Friday, as it turns out. And as part of that budget request for $10.5 billion, we include close to $900 million for the TIP Directorate. And then you see how TIP, these are not numbers just for TIP. These numbers for advanced manufacturing, wireless, and so forth also include investments by other directorates as well. But how we partner with the other directorates to really fuel innovations in a whole host of key technology areas that will also help address some of the societal and economic challenges that I was describing earlier. I think a really important point for me anyway on this slide is the fact that at the end of the day, when we talk about the TIP Directorate, this is not about robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will. The NSF budget in this request grows by about $1.7 billion. And of that, about $500 million is for TIP. The rest of the funding that gets you to $880 million is existing programs that are being repositioned into the Directorate. So that means there's about $1.2 billion of funding that's left for the rest of the foundation as well. So this is meant to be a rising tide lifts all boats mentality for the foundation and for the scientific enterprise that the foundation has long supported. So I hope that gives you a sense for how we think about the TIP Directorate. And if I may, I'll conclude with just one slide here that really speaks to our role in this ecosystem at the end of the day. If you think about that progression from lab to society, And on the left-hand side, you have investments, largely public investments, federal investments, for example, that contribute to basic research. You have private investments from industry that do more of the product development, more of the commercialization piece on the right-hand side. We think of TIP as bridging this so-called valley of death that many of us are familiar with that sits in between. And in many ways, that valley of death for us is our ramp of opportunity, starting from use-inspired research and the symbiosis with foundational research through our collaborations with the other directorates at NSF, and progressing forward through collaborations with other agencies, with industry, with state and local and tribal governments, with civil society and so forth, really using this as a ramp of opportunity to understand what are the points at which we can have interventions that can help us be able to power breakthroughs that get across that valley of death and can have impact in a positive way on society in the long run. So with that, I'll pause. I see we have a little bit of time for questions. I want to thank you again for listening. I hope that this has been a helpful overview for the Directorate, and I look forward to your engagement either today or I encourage you to check out the TIP website that you see here at the top and email us at tip@nsf.gov. And additionally, feel free to reach out to the leadership team that you see represented here for TIP as well.